Good evening. The lesson I wish to give tonight, I was mentioning this morning in our before our sermon this morning. The lesson I want to give tonight is one that I have given many times before, hardly ever though in a church building. I've given this lesson the place I've given this the most is in a secular college. I was invited. I happen to know the teacher. He was a preacher for the Lord's church. And I was invited by him to come in and be the religious expert during one of his ethics classes. That's kind of nice when you know someone like that you can do that. But he brought me in as a religious expert, and I was to talk on, does God exist? Because it's a philosophy class and the idea of seeing the philosophies that were there. Well, I didn't handle it with philosophy. When I went in, I would go in, and I didn't bring my Bible up with me now. I should have it, since I'm going to read from a scripture before we start. But I would go in, and I would have my Bible with me, and I would lay it down on the table right there, and I would let people know that I'm going to show them that God does exist, and I'm not going to use my Bible. To them, I didn't use my Bible. This evening, we're going to have a Bible verse before we start, because there is something very relevant for us to note in there about how I am able to prove from science that there has to be a God. That science demands it. By the way, they want to make us believe that scientists have proven that evolution has occurred, that scientists have proven the Big Bang Theory, that scientists have proven these things. Please understand something. There are many, many, many scientists that do not believe in the Big Bang Theory, that do not believe in evolution, who do believe in God. And it's not because necessarily, no doubt there are scientists who believe that, because they're brought up in churches that taught that. But there are also scientists who have come to that conclusion because of what they learned from science. Science is what made them realize there has to be a God. And that's what we're going to be looking at tonight. And this is certainly not an in-depth study on that subject. We're only going to take the normal amount of time for me to give a sermon, okay? By the way, normally I teach this in a class. I teach it as a discussion class. And that's why I have a hard time keeping it in with a certain amount of time that I was required to in my classes. But because we're going to do it in sermon format, it should be about the same amount of time as I normally go, which is already long anyway. But it'll still be that same amount of time. So I go in, tell them I'm going to show them that there is a God, and I'm not going to prove it by going to the Bible, because, that is not scientific method. And one of the things I point out to them is this when I start out the class. I point out to them that faith has no business in science. Science cannot work with faith. Now that may sound a little bit strange given what I'm going to be talking about here in this lesson. Because normally when you say faith has no place in the Bible, the scientists will go, you're right. You don't need to be discussing God no place in science. They say, that's right. You don't need to be talking about God in science. And that's not what I'm saying. Faith is something that you believe because you don't have all the facts. I realize faith, what the Bible says about faith is the evidence of things not seen. Well, science has to have seen. Science has to have that. And that's going to be very important for my point on why evolution doesn't belong in science. Evolution is faith-based, has no business in science. Oh, I'm sorry, Big Bang Theory. It's true about evolution too. But tonight we're going to see about the Big Bang Theory. It has no place in science. It's faith-based. And so that's why I make that point at the beginning of the class. Now, I don't tell them why I did it at the beginning of the class, because I want them to come to realize that when we get to that point. But when we get to that point, I'm going to show you, I want you to see that Big Bang Theory is faith-based. There is no proof. By the way, why is it called a theory? I'm used to doing this in discussion class. You know why it's called a theory, don't you? It's called a theory because it's not proven. If I was to drop this and I don't want to damage that. If I was to drop this on this top of this pulpit, we know it falls, and it follows a law, the law of gravity. Okay? It's not called the Big Bang Law or the law of the Big Bang. By the way, it's not called the law of evolution either. It's called the theory of evolution. It's called the theory, the Big Bang Theory. I love that TV show, by the way, for a number of reasons. But one reason I love it is because it keeps that phrase right in front of the public's eyes so that I can point it out. It's a theory. It's not a law. And so when we are wanting to discuss this subject, we should not be afraid to go to science. God gave us science, true science. Science is merely a study of God's creation. That's all it is. And God's creation is very orderly. God's creation is very easy to be studied. You can get into it. We're even getting down to where we're studying as far down as close as we can get to atoms. Okay? We know how atoms are built up. We can study down into it. And yet, as far down as we can go, look at studying the atom, and as far as we can go and studying various things, they still haven't proven the Big Bang. They haven't proven evolution. And that's why they're still theories. They don't like us to notice that. They want us to believe it's a known fact that it occurred, but it is not. I'm going to show you why, as far as the Big Bang is concerned, it cannot be proven, because the Big Bang is impossible. The way they describe it, what they say happened, is impossible. And we're going to see that tonight. This question, does God exist, is one that's easily answered. Easily answered. Easily answered by someone who has a dog in the fight. I'm a preacher. I can answer it easy. Yes, he does. God exists. End of statement. Or the atheist would say, no, he doesn't. Easily answered. The atheist can say, no, he doesn't. No, I know that he doesn't. He doesn't. Easily answered. We do it all the time. It's also easily answered by those who let others do their thinking. Well, my preacher or my Bible teacher is so smart, and he says that God exists, so God must exist. And vice versa. Someone I really respected when I was in school has all sorts of letters after his name. He's a very smart individual, or she's a very smart individual. That individual said that God does not exist. So I believe it because of how much trust I put in my preacher or my evolutionist teacher. I believe that. It's also easily answered by those who don't care. And I get this, by the way, sometime in my classes. You can tell the ones who don't care whether God exists. They're the ones who are there to get an easy grade. And by the way, this guy's class is an easy grade. All the sports people take his class because he's not tough in class and they get an easy grade. Okay? He says that. I'm not telling anything on him. He says it. It's an easy grade. They come in to take my class. And so I do. When I'm teaching the class, there are people in the back of the class who really don't care whether I prove this or not. It doesn't affect them at all as long as they can play ball or whatever it is they want to do. Now, answering it correctly, however, is harder. It requires one to ignore his biases. That's hard for a Christian. Hey, maybe God doesn't exist. What if science proves that? What am I going to do? And vice versa. The atheist who doesn't want to believe in God. What if I find out God does exist? It's harder because I have to ignore my biases to find out exactly what is truth. Because truth is something that I know the Bible says truth will set you free, but science believes that. Truth is important for science. That's why one place, and in all places for true science, Bible and science have a lot in common. And it makes sense because the same individual gave us both. God. Secondly, it requires one to think for himself, to ignore what he or she has been told by people they respect, to look at it to truly see what is the truth. And for those who don't care, it requires one to be willing to extend the effort to find out. We got busy lives. We do lots in our lives. We got importance. With parents, you have children or more children. You have the difficulties of relationships with people in the world, where you're going with your job. We have all sorts of important things in our lives. So that to put out the effort to make a decision of something that I believe ever since I was a kid, why? Why do it? Well, quite frankly, for us Christians, it's a very important reason to do it. Because I don't care where you go on TV, my favorite news channel is always talking about how they found some bones of a creature that lived so many millions of years ago. And they just state it. This is how many millions of years ago that creature lived. And my Bible says, gives me a genealogy that I'm able to count backwards and see that the world is really only thousands of years old. Now, which one is it? And there's a lot of people with theistic evolution, for instance, trying to get the two to go together. There's a lot of smart brethren who claim that they have done that. There's also other smart brethren who say, no, you didn't. You know, and for those scientists, I said a little bit earlier, how there are so many scientists that don't believe in evolution. Do you know what they normally say about those scientists? Well, those scientists aren't reliable scientists. They're not reliable. And why aren't they reliable? Did they get worse grades in school? No, they got just as good a grades as the other people. Was the schools they went to bad schools? No, many of them went to really good schools. Is their scientific method that they're using wrong? No, I can't say anything bad about their scientific method. What makes them not reliable? And if you back them into a corner, they'll tell you what makes them not reliable is the fact that they say evolution didn't occur. That's what makes them not reliable. That's a religion. That's faith-based. That is not enough to be able to say something is true. How do we know something? You know, when I teach this class, when I taught, I don't think I'm ever going to be able to go back. That teacher, I doubt he's going to be teaching again. He's not very healthy right now. I would love to be able to go back. But when I teach this class, I was teaching it to a college of the sciences, medical sciences, but of the sciences. So, you know, they certainly get biology and things of that nature. How do we know something? How do you prove that God exists? This is one of the things that they feel that we can't do. For that matter, how do you prove that God doesn't exist? Quite frankly, we ask that of people, and that's not a fair question. It's never on the person who believes something, who doesn't believe something, to prove that that something they don't believe isn't true. But it's not right for us to ask atheists to prove that God doesn't exist. You don't prove a negative. It is necessary for us to prove, especially if we're going to convert an atheist, for us to be able to prove scientifically that God must exist. That's why, once again, I think this is an important thing for us Christians to understand. Okay? So how do we know something? We know what we experience, don't we? Our five senses help us to experience. That's normally what we go by in science. We see something, we hear something, we taste something, we touch something, we smell something. That's how we discover in this world that we have, the senses that we have as people, as human beings on this earth. So let me ask you a question. Can one see, hear, taste, touch, smell God? Now, when I get to that point, I'm fairly certain that many of my students think they got me. Because unless you believe that God speaks to you, and some people do believe that, they hear his voice, he tells them something to do. You know, and I've even talked to some of those people who say that God speaks to them, and I'll ask them, does he sound like George Burns, or who's the other guy who played God? You know, I know I'm being a little bit facetious. But then they say, no, I don't hear voices. I just get this feeling that tells me that God is wanting me to do something. Well, I see that once again, you're not hearing anything. And I'm not going to go into that. But just because you know, we cannot see, hear, taste, touch, or smell God. But let me ask you something we do know exists. Can you see, hear, taste, touch, or smell the wind? Now, before you say, yes, when the wind blows, I can feel it going across my face. No, you don't. You do not feel the wind going across your face. What do you feel going across your face? You feel air going across your face. You are not feeling wind. You're not hearing wind when it's rustling the leaves in the trees. You're hearing the trees. You're not smelling wind when you smell a storm coming on and the wind is blowing it in. You're smelling the moisture in the air. You know there's a storm coming on. You see where I'm going with this? We believe in the wind, even though we cannot see, hear, taste, touch, or smell the wind, because we can see the effects of the wind. That's how we know there's wind. That's the same thing with gravity. We can see the effects of gravity. You believe gravity just by my dropping that thing without any scientific method except for seeing something fall to the ground. You believe in gravity. I have to say that because I think they have figured out a way to gauge the electromagnetic force of gravity. But for wind, we just know it's there because we see the effects. That's how we know God. Go with me, if you will, to Romans chapter 1. This will be the only verses that we go to in God's Word tonight. But I want you to see that God makes it clear that through science we should be able to know Him, about Him. The very fact that He exists, we should know from His own creation, and that's all science is the study of His creation. And He says, if you look at creation, you should know that I'm there. Verses 18 through 20. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth in unrighteousness. What truth, Paul? Look at verse 19. Because that which is known about God is evident within them. For God made it evident to them. For since the creation of the world, His invisible attributes, His eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood through what has been made, so that they are without excuse. If you look at the world, you will know there's a God. And that's what we're going to see tonight. By the way, isn't it interesting? You don't go into some deep, dark jungle and find a bunch of tribesmen who are atheists. You ever notice that? It takes an education to become an atheist. You have to grow in knowledge to learn from people that there is no God. Why is that? Because you look around and you go, look at those mountains. Look at those trees. Look at the stars. Who did that? No one ever sits there and goes, it must have come about by accident. Until we get educated into recognizing that accidental things like that happen. But sadly, that's not being educated in science. That's being educated in faith. And faith has no place in science. More questions. Do you know who the first president of the United States was? Now, before you say George Washington, because that's the answer I would give too, prove it scientifically. Well, I could pull a dollar bill out. Well, you were told that was George Washington on your dollar bill. You never met George Washington, did you? You never heard him. I don't want to go into taste. You never touched him. How do you know that's George Washington? Well, we can dig up his grave. Once again, you're going by the tombstone that says George Washington. How do you know that's George Washington? Quite frankly, is Albert Brown preaching tonight? Well, yeah, Albert, we hired you. Yeah, I told you my name was Albert Brown. Maybe I killed him and took his place. And way back when I first got here, he's gone. Julie is just an accomplice. Her name's not Julie either. You see what I'm saying? You're going by hearsay, and that's fine with relationships and hiring a preacher and stuff like that. That's fine. But it has no place in science. No place. Science deals with facts. What's the fact? And this idea, the same thing with whether or not men visited the moon. Well, now, Albert, I got you on that one. I saw that on TV. I did see it. Many of you didn't see it on TV because you're way too young. I saw it live on TV. By the way, I also saw Captain Kirk beam upon the Enterprise off of Vulcan one time. Oh, no, but Albert, the one you're talking about is a TV show, and the other one is a fact. Do you realize there's still a lot of people in this country who think that the moon landing was done in Hollywood? 2, conspiracy theorists. Prove them wrong. Well, we got moon rocks. Who told you it was a moon rock? Now, mind you, I am not a conspiracy theorist, and I believe we landed on the moon. But it's not science to say they did it. It's faith that the people who told you they did it, did it. Thirdly, have they found the Titanic? And once again, someone would say, I've even seen the sub taking pictures of it. And I saw it sink. And what was their names on the end, holding on as it was going down? Yeah, but Albert, one's a movie. Yes, exactly. How do you know? It takes faith. And I believe the Titanic, I believe they found the Titanic. I believe what they say about it, just because I accept what they say. You can't do that with science. It has no place. Thomas Aquinas. Here's a caveman, right? What did he live? He lived 800 years ago. Not a caveman. But what kind of science would this guy have? We've outstripped him in science, except he came up with 5 proofs that God exists. And 4 of them still cannot be proven wrong. I think I can run holes all through one of his. I really do think I could. But the other 4 are still scientific facts today. All right, look at this. I saw this stuff without going to it. Okay, here's the first one. Argument of motion. Mind you, this is 800 years ago. This is why truth cannot be denied. This guy has not got the education of our people today, of our scientists today, of our high schoolers today, or our elementary kids today. He doesn't have that teaching. He merely has the facts. That's all he has. The fact is, an object at rest tends to stay at rest. What's it going to take for that to move? It's going to take something that's strong enough and it's heavy enough to push against it so you don't get pushed back. Try to move your house, for instance. It's strong enough to be able to push it so that it'll move. And I can. And if you were out in the foyer, you couldn't see in here, maybe those windows were blocked, and I took this thing and threw it, and you can't see me, but you would know that I exist because you saw this thing fly through the air, and someone or something had to have caused that to throw through the air because of a thing that we know without even being educated in science, that it takes something to move another thing or someone to move another thing when it's already at rest. It's a requirement. They tend to stay at rest. For every reaction, there is an equal and opposite action. Now, you probably have learned it the other way, but I'm talking about the reaction that we see that tells us there's a God. That's where I'm going. And besides, A equals B, B equals A. It works both directions. Okay? So for every reaction, there is an opposite and equal action. There has to be. For it to occur, something had to have been there to cause it. So here's the question. The universe is in motion. What's big enough to have moved the universe and put it in motion? Easily answered. That's why they came up with the Big Bang. They would have to come up with the Big Bang, because science proves that there has to be something big enough. And what's big enough to move a universe? Which is, by the way, everything. They came up with a pretty good answer. The answer is all of the matter in the universe was compressed all the way down to a very small place. In fact, what they tell you is, if you open up a book like our Bible and you see a little period, all the matter in the universe was pushed down into something about the size of the period on your page. Now, they do that with the universe, and people just sit there and listen to them. I want you to imagine how hard it would be to compress my car down that small. I don't even think we have the technology to do that. But they say everything in the universe, that's everything, was compressed down to that size. And by the way, they are correct. If it were possible to do such a thing, actually it is possible to do such a thing for God, but they don't want to believe in God, so we can't talk about him. But if it were possible to do that, that would cause so much heat that there would suddenly be an explosion or bang, and it would be very big. Big bang. And basically what you have is everything in the universe pushing off of everything in the universe. And that's why they had to come up with that idea. It had to be, if you're not going to believe in a God who created, who did it. It had to be. They're right. It had to be. But there's a problem. There's the question, what is the source of the first motion? So stay with that idea. Right now we recognize that there had to have been something, and the Big Bang is really the only answer. There is no other answer. Here's where we're going to prove the Big Bang couldn't have happened. And then the motion is going to have to point to God. Argument from cause. Either matter is eternal or it's created. Give me another possibility. Matter is either eternal or it's been created. What I mean by that is, matter's here. How did it get here? Had to have been someone who was big enough and strong enough to create it, if it was created. Now, the other answer is, well, it's always been here. Matter's always been. Problem with that is we have something that's called entropy. I know about entropy because I'm a Star Trek fan, and they had one of the novels was the entropy effect, and so reading books teaches, even science fiction. But entropy is the fact that everything is falling apart. I'm falling apart. I've got a bad back. I've got my right foot hurts a lot. I've got all sorts of difficulties that are happening to me that I didn't have when I was 20 years old. And quite frankly, the day I was conceived, the day my heart started beating, my heart started falling apart. Because if you cause something to beat a lot, like a lifetime, it eventually wears out. Because that's life. That's entropy. I believe that's what was being spoken of when Paul points out that the universe has been cursed. Creation's been cursed. Because remember, Adam and Eve needed to be able to stand somewhere, and they were in a garden with a tree of life that was going to allow them to live forever. How were they going to be able to live forever if the world fell apart? I believe this universe, the entropy effect, wasn't in the beginning, but it became something somewhere. The second law of thermodynamics says that in a closed system, entropy occurs. Because things are falling apart, entropy occurs. There has to be something that's putting into the system to cause it to get better. A car engine, for instance, is a way to tell. Eventually, a car engine, they've gotten really good. Car engines last a long time. But eventually, because of the pistons going up and down and up and down and up and down, eventually something goes. Moving parts. And needs to be fixed. And so somewhere a mechanic has to come in and put in outside. Normally what we do is throw away and buy another one. But someone has to come in and they will fix it. And that's the same thing with the universe. If something on the outside doesn't do something, this universe is falling apart. Here's the scientific stuff. I don't like that one. It's got a lot of big words that you really have to think about to understand it. What I prefer is what Isaac Asimov said. He's a science fiction writer, but he's also a scientist. And Isaac Asimov said it this way. Another way of stating the second law is the universe is constantly getting more disorderly. It's falling apart. Let me give you an example. Uranium. What makes uranium radioactive? No, what makes uranium radioactive is uranium is trying to go, it's an unstable element, and it's trying to go down into a smaller part a lot faster than most things. Most things in this universe, most elements they're all trying to go down to hydrogen and helium atoms. And if you got enough time to wait, millions and millions of years, eventually this entire universe, or probably billions or trillions of years, eventually this entire universe is going to be down to their most basic elements, hydrogen and helium atoms, because the universe, proven science, is falling apart. It's going down to the basic elements. If we were to be able to have a time machine and we'd close off this room and we'd go 1,000 years into the future, and we got out of our time machine, unsealed this room and came inside, we'd find dust. What's dust? Well, things are falling apart and trickling down, and we get dust. If we were to go to 1,000,000 years in the future and come into this room, had hired someone to take care of the outside of the building, came into this room, what would we find? This podium would be dust because it's falling apart. All by itself, gravity pulling it down, eventually it weakens, it breaks down, it falls into a heap, and it would become dust. Just because of entropy. Viewed this way, we can see the second law of thermodynamics all around us. We have to work hard to straighten a room, but left to itself, it becomes messy again, and quickly and very easily. Even if we never enter it, it becomes dusty and musty, and it has to be taken care of. How difficult to maintain houses and machinery. When my family moved to West Virginia, we bought a house that was built in 1920. I think it was 1920. No. Anyway, long time ago. I can't remember exactly. 20s, I think. It was in pretty good shape. There was a house across the hollow that was built later, about 10 or 20 years later, and it was falling apart. What was the difference? The house we lived in, people had been living in, and they had been repairing it, taking care of it. The other house, no one had been living in, and it had just been sitting there. And it was falling apart. Since I've known about the house, the roof has fallen in. No one came in with sledgehammers to tear it down. It fell in because of entropy, because that's exactly what's happening to everything. All we have to do is do nothing, and everything deteriorates, collapses, breaks down, wears out, all by itself. That's the second law of thermodynamics. Okay, here's the Big Bang Theory. Everything was chaos and disorder. Like I said earlier, it was compressed down to about the size of a period, and there was a Big Bang. And when a Big Bang occurred, everything was destroyed, was basically because it was such a huge explosion. They're right, it would be a huge explosion. Because it was such a huge explosion, it was put down into its most basic elements, hydrogen and helium, and then it... Wait a minute, time out. Second law of thermodynamics, everything is trying to get down to hydrogen and helium. What happens after it gets down to hydrogen and helium? There's nothing further to go down to. And so the second law of thermodynamics threw itself in reverse? No, laws don't do that. It's a law. It would take a God to do that. And that's why a lot of people believe in theistic evolution. Now, mind you, the class that I'm teaching, when I teach this class, I'm just trying to prove there's a God. And I tell them what I believe. I believe what the Bible says about creation. But I could stop right now and just proven there has to be a God. Because first off, everything has a source, motion is obvious, it's proven. Something had to have pushed the universe. The only way they could prove the universe has been pushed is to come up with the Big Bang, and that would push the universe. But unfortunately, it would also put the universe all the way down to hydrogen and helium atoms, which they freely admit. And then it got more complex. Scientifically impossible. There had to have been something that can change the laws of the universe, and we call that a miracle. Because that's what it would take. It would take someone with enough miraculous power to change a law of the universe, like walking on water. Law of gravity was broken. Law of buoyancy was broken. Buoyancy was broken. That's why it's a miracle. And so that's why second law of thermodynamics proves there has to be a God, especially when you combine it with the law of motion, which you can prove obviously the universe is in motion. What pushed it? God did. God pushed it. God set it in motion. There's no other possibility because you're talking about the entire universe. Argument from necessity. Nothing can ever come from nothing. If I was to show you my hands and go like this and then open it up and a bird flies out, we call that a magic trick. And I probably did an illusion. You would say, well, that was a trick. Why would you say that's a trick? Because of something we know. Nothing can come from nothing. And I'll do this all day long. There's not going to be any bird fly out. Okay? If a bird flies out, it's God. All right? I can't do that. Because nothing comes from nothing. So matter had to have a source. The first law of thermodynamics shows that nothing is being created. This universe we have today still has the same amount of matter in it that it had when God first created it. Wait a minute, Albert. I can take a log and throw it in my fireplace and burn it up. You did not destroy any matter. You merely took it down to its basic elements, or close enough. Took it closer to its basic elements. The same amount of matter is there. You cannot destroy matter. Scientific proof. Atoms are atoms are atoms. You can merely change molecular structure. By necessity, everything had to have a cause. And that question comes up again, where did all the matter in the universe come from? Now, if you're going to say it's always been here, second law of thermodynamics would have taken it down to dust a long, long time ago. I mean, I can't even think of eternal. Matter's eternal? That one doesn't even make sense. How could it always have been? And if it's always been, it would already be in hydrogen and helium. Because forever is a long time. It would have happened by now. What caused matter to exist? It's either always been or it was created. And it would take a God to create all the matter in the universe. There has to be a God. Final thing. Argument from intelligent design. Order does not come from chaos without intelligent design. You all know that I like science fiction movies. One of my favorite is the second Star Trek movie that came out. Remember when Han Solo was trying to fly the Millennium Falcon? Did I say Star Trek? That's a sin in science fiction world, isn't it? Thank you. The second Star Wars movie that came out. Han Solo trying to fly the Millennium Falcon through an asteroid. Remember how that was? All the asteroids were going this way and that way and everything like that. Obviously, what must have happened at some point in time, although something collided and you have all sorts of stuff flying around. which is exactly what would happen when you have an explosion. Imagine exploding a junkyard, and that junkyard setting itself in such nice order that the old saying is that a 747 is there. Not only is it there, but it's running, and all the dials are set correctly. That's how big the explosion was. Because that's exactly what it would take. That's the same level of design that you have with this universe. How do we know that? This universe is a very orderly place. We can predict when the sun is going to rise tomorrow. How can we do that? Is that like prophecy? No. It's science. The earth is spinning, and it's going around the sun, but because of the spin, we know how fast it's going. We know exactly where the tilt of the sun is at the time of the year that we're in, and we know exactly when the sun is going to come across the horizon. And that's a sunrise for us. Actually, it's the earth turning, but we call it a sunrise. Space probe sent from NASA. When we send a probe, for instance, they sent a probe to Mars. The first one they sent, remember the Mars rover? We got 2 of them on the planet right now. We tried to send, the first one we sent, went from the Earth, went all the way to Mars, orbited Mars in the capsule that took it, in the spacecraft that took it, dropped out of the spacecraft, chute came open and smashed and made a junkyard on Mars. Why? Did Mars move? Was Mars not where it was supposed to be? Was there something wrong about Mars? No, that wasn't the problem. 2 different engineers, one using the standard measurement system and the other one using the metric measuring system, and they thought each other was using the one they were using. And so when they combined their numbers, they made a billion-dollar junkyard on Mars. It takes a man's mistake to have something to happen that way, because the Mars is moving too orderly for us to not know where it's going to be. 2 years earlier, when the spacecraft was fired off, they knew where Mars was going to be 2 years from that point to be able to get the spacecraft to Mars. You had to shoot this way when Mars was over here, because we knew exactly where Mars was going to be 2 years later. That's how orderly this universe is. Or DNA. That's like a computer program. So orderly. We can't even tap into it to be able to read the code. Not totally. We cannot know. We can't go. And it's something doesn't happen by accident. It takes faith to believe this happened by accident. More faith than to believe in a miracle. At least when you say Jesus walked on the water, you're giving someone the credit, God. But when you say the universe came together all by itself because of an accidental explosion, who gets the credit? An accident. We need more accidents like that. What they'll normally say is, it evolved. It evolved that way. DNA happened because the ones who were able to survive were able to cause that to happen. Now, there's several things that just don't make sense on that stand. For instance, there's this one beetle called the bombardier beetle. You ever hear of that one? Bombardier beetle. It's like a skunk in a sense. A skunk sends out a spray that causes its predators to not want to come anywhere near it because it stinks. Bombardier beetle instead has 2 chemicals it shoots out of its rear end that when combined cause a small explosion, which makes a predator not want to get any closer. Like a frog, for instance. Now, to be able to evolve into a creature that would have 2 chemicals that they touch each other, they're going to cause an explosion. I could see very well how its ancestors were going to get it right the first time and not blow their butts off. before they could have the ability to reproduce? How do you believe that's possible? It's not possible. It takes a God to be able to create a bombardier beetle. It takes a God. Scientifically, God must exist. The atheists, as God says in Romans chapter 1, have no excuse. They should know by looking around. And by the way, I find it very ironic. If you read the rest of Romans, I'm wanting to teach Romans here. I think we are going to be doing it unless someone comes up with something different on Sunday mornings. But when you get to that chapter 1 and you read through what happens after those verses, it sounds like what's happening in this nation today. And what's interesting is once they stopped believing in God, it says they started worshiping animals. And it's not too unlike our worship in this country of evolution. And once you start believing that way, read the rest of the verses after that and read what we're seeing in our culture today. What has occurred. We're going to study that if we start that on Sunday morning. Given where it is in the chapter, it'll probably take me 4 weeks to get there, but we're going to study that. Okay? And it's a wonderful study. Lesson tonight has been one to, I hope, give more faith in God. And to not accept what the world is saying, that you can't prove there's a God. You can prove there's a God. There has to be one. There has to be one, or else, well, there has to be one. You can't explain this. If you're not a Christian, maybe it's because you've been wondering if there was a God. Quite frankly, when I married my first wife, I come to find out something that startled me. She was brought up in a Christian home, but she was doubting God because she said everything that science knows. No, we talked about it, and she come to realize, and she was very interested in this kind of study too. And she got her faith back. But because of what our kids are being taught in school, that they've proven it, and it's only a theory. They haven't proved anything. With all of these decades that they've been trying to prove it, they haven't proved it. Big Bang is a myth that takes faith to believe in. Evolution is a myth. Next week, dinosaurs. Were they really millions of years ago? Nope. And I'm going to show you proof of dinosaurs within the last 500 years. You guys are going to miss it. No, it's going to be on Facebook. I got that. If anyone needs to become a Christian, or if anyone needs the prayers of the church, any way we can help you, let us know as we stand and sing.